Between 1914 and 1918, the great powers of Europe would find themselves embroiled in the First World War. For many of the traditional countries in Europe, this war would prove to be the end of their world. In response to the July crisis of 1914, caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria would invade Serbia. For reasons too obvious to even question, this would result in Russia being at war with the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. For the big three empires involved at the beginning of World War I, the war seemed to start well for all but the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which failed to conquer Serbia in 1914. The German Empire started off by advancing rapidly in the west against France, and the Russian Empire started off by pushing into Galicia in Austria-Hungary and East Prussia in Germany. However, these early successes would turn into disappointments, with the German advances into France bogging down into trench warfare, and the Germans gradually pushing back the Russians on the Eastern Front. The war would end up dragging out into a long war of attrition. Eventually, the war would lead to the destruction of all of the traditional empires involved. The question, who would break first? The Russian Empire would prove to be the weakest. The Russian Empire was the largest country in Europe. It was ruled by the Tsar with the support of the Russian Orthodox Church. However, Russia had some problems. Only 44% of the population was Russian, and around 70% practiced Eastern Orthodoxy. Russia had lost 3 million soldiers in the war, and had suffered 3 to 5 million injuries. This, combined with the hunger that Russian workers and peasants were experiencing due to food shortages, would result in the power of the Tsar's regime beginning to crack. In March 1917, the Russians would experience the February Revolution, so called because Russia still followed the Julian calendar, so it was February in Russia as opposed to March. In this revolution, the Russian Duma, or parliament, as well as the Russian military, would end up opposing the Tsar, and they would establish a capitalist democracy under the control of Alexander Kerensky. In order to maintain good relations with their allies, the Kerensky government would choose to remain in the war. This would prove to be unpopular with the Russian people, who wanted food, peace, and wealth, all of which were prevented from Russia continuing to fight in the war. That dissatisfaction would allow someone new to enter the scene. That man was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin received support from the Germans, who brought him from Switzerland back to Russia, and Lenin's goal was to use this support to turn Russia into a communist state. In November 1917, through the same calendar quirk as the February Revolution, Russia would experience the October Revolution. The October Revolution saw Lenin and his Bolshevik, or Communist Party, seizing power from the Russian Provisional Government. However, as soon as the Communists seized power in 1917, groups such as the Old Aristocracy, the Russian Orthodox Church, and other organizations opposed to the Communist Party would begin to form an anti-communist, also known as White Movement, which would attempt to revive the old Russia. In order to ensure his revolution, Vladimir Lenin sent his supporter, Leon Trotsky, to make peace with the Germans. The Russians, now the Soviets, would meet with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk, and they would agree upon the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And while the treaty was so harsh that Russia initially rejected the treaty, resulting in Germany invading Russia again, the powers finally agreed to the treaty, and Russia was able, despite its losses, to focus on what it considered to be the real challenge. The Russian Civil War would last from 1917 to 1923, and it would see the Reds, or the Russian Communists, fighting against the Whites, or the anti-communist forces. The Reds controlled the Russian heartland, including the cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. This land held most of the industrial power of Russia, as well as most of the population. However, to oppose them, the Whites held a lot of the territory of the periphery, including Siberia, parts of Ukraine, and the Caucasus. The Whites had an experienced army, as well as the support of the Entente powers. The control of the heartland would prove to be more effective than international support, and the Reds would end up winning the Russian Civil War. The Red Russians would attempt to re-establish their control over the former borderlands of the empire, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. Well, they would succeed in conquering Ukraine, they were unable to conquer Poland or the Baltic states due to local resistance. During the Civil War, Lenin attempted to transform the Russian economy to be fully communist as quickly as possible. However, due to the backwards nature of the Russian economy, this proved to be very difficult, and was only able to meet with limited success due to the oppression of the Russian people, particularly the peasants. As a result, later on, Lenin decided to switch away from this system, later called war communism, to adopt the new economic policy, which combined state ownership and communism with features of a capitalist economy as well as powerful landowning peasants. Lenin would use new access to education, as well as massive propaganda campaigns, to gain support for his policies, including his war against the Church, where he attempted to destroy the power of the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as seize as much of its wealth as possible. The remaining capitalist components of the Russian economy led to many considering the revolution only half finished, and, with the ailing health of Vladimir Lenin, new contenders, such as Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, found themselves competing to become the new leader of the Soviet Union. Their struggle and the eventual victory of Joseph Stalin would lead to a much deadlier period of suppression and violence than anything experienced under Lenin.